Hello and welcome to this special episode of The Booking Club, taken from Fiction First, the Booking Club's first live event dedicated to literary fiction, where we speak to 6 of 2025's most exciting debut novelists. A big thank you to our collaborators, Conduit Books. Enjoy, and we look forward to welcoming you at future events. Welcome to Fiction First, the Booking Club. Thank you. The Booking Club's first exploration into the world of the literary novel. We're blessed really to be joined by so many great debut novelists this evening who will be talking to us about their breakthrough works, their journeys to publication, their literary influences, the role that identity has played in their work, and the future of the novel. So I'm going to ask the novelists to now introduce themselves from my right to left, your left to right, starting with you, William.
Yeah, last in, first on. My name's William Rayfet Hunter, and my debut is called Sunstruck. It follows the story of a young man who visits a friend in the south of France at her family's chateau. They are rich and glamorous, and he is fully taken by all of them, especially her oldest brother Felix, with whom he starts a love affair that brings to the fore the parts of themselves that they're trying to hide. And it's about falling in love across boundaries of race and of class and of position, and what that can do to everyone involved.
Hi, I'm Harriet Armstrong, and my novel is called To Vest Our Minds and Bodies. It follows a woman's final year of university as she kind of tries and fails to connect with other people and find her own identity as well.
Hi, I'm Thomas Peermohamed Lambert. I've also written a campus novel. It's called Shibboleth. It's set during the second year, not the final year, of university, of the main character, who's a guy called Edward. And it follows, similarly, his attempts to fit in to what can sometimes be quite a hostile and manic sort of social milieu that he inhabits.
Hi, I'm Rowe, Irvin. My book, Life Cycle of a Moth, came out last month. It's about a mother and daughter living in isolation in a forest, and the daughter has never left this forest. So it's about, I suppose, her strange worldview and why they're there, and what happens when an external force, stranger, infiltrates that space and changes that dynamic.
Hello, my name is Lisa Smith, and my novel is called Jamaica Road. It's a coming-of-age novel set in South London during the 1980s through to the early 90s. And the narrator is a British Jamaican girl called Daphne, and the other main character in the novel is a boy called Connie, who at the start of the novel has recently arrived from Jamaica. So coming of age, belonging, friendship, love and family.
Hi everyone, my name is Nicolas Padamsee. My debut novel is called England is Mine. It follows 2 teenage boys, David and Hassan, as they struggle to become men with tensions rising around them, both offline in East London and online on social media. They both start college full of promise, but suffer senseless acts of violence which change the course of their lives. So desperate to recover some dignity, David's drawn to the far right, while Hassan attempts a more optimistic reinvention. And the novel charts the different directions they take and how their fates entwine.
My name is Jack Aldane. I'm the host and producer of The Booking Club. I think you'll agree that's a fantastic range, such a rich variety of subjects, all coalescing around the themes that I mentioned earlier. You know, I'm sure your paths to publication vary, but perhaps we can start with you, William. Could you tell us a little bit about the process in terms of some of the most surprising, pleasantly and otherwise, stages that you found yourself going through in order to get to publication today?
Absolutely. Yeah, Sunstruck came about kind of through the back door. I haven't taken the traditional route into publishing. I entered and ended up winning the Murky Books New Writers Prize in 2022. It's a prize for writers who don't have an agent and who haven't published any work. And so I had been working on this novel a bit, kind of had a few thousand words tucked away in a drawer somewhere, and decided that I would submit it because a friend said it was okay. She literally said okay. I was like, maybe. So I sent it in and got shortlisted and given some notes. And then, they rang me in early 2023 to tell me that I'd won and they were giving me a contract to publish it. My route in was really strange. And from there, I then sort of had to finish a novel. And they gave me, I gave myself a year to do it. They kind of looked at me and were like, are you sure? I was like, is that too long or too short? I didn't really know. But I then kind of got into publishing that way. And it's been kind of a wonderful journey since. I always wanted to do this and I was working towards it. My goal for 2023 was to finish the novel and then start sending it out. And that process all got very sped up. So I'm really very grateful for the Mercury Prize and for what it's done for my career.
Does that ring true of anybody else's experiences? Nicolas, I can see you're thinking there. Is there memories now that are coming back about where it all started for you with England is Mine?
I think in some ways it was sort of a novel I've been thinking about writing for 15, 20 years. If everyone has sort of one book that, made them fall in love with literature, then for me that was Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. I remember the experience of reading it as a teenager in this sort of sweaty, frantic, thrilling journey with a sensitive, yet also clearly narcissistic murderer, and trying to understand why he did what he did. I remember after reading it for weeks trying to untangle the sort of knot of possible reasons Dostoevsky sort of sets up for you. And as well as sparking an interest in literature, it also sparked an interest in extremism and radicalization. And I remember over the years that followed, I read sort of countless novels in the subject area, Hanif Qureshi's The Black Album, Guy Gunnaratne's In Our Mad and Furious City, Camille Shamsi's Home Fire, and I enjoyed them all greatly. But I started to notice that no novelists were exploring the connection between the current wave of radicalization in Europe and the experience of life online. In all of those novels, the radicalization still took place offline. And it felt like quite a strange omission. And I think sort of that was sort of the spark, sort of the in to realizing, what sort of I could write that was maybe different to a lot of the books I'd loved. So then I applied for a creative writing PhD to study extremism and radicalization, knowing they would take a lot of research to get a book like that right. England is Mine came out of that PhD.
Lisa, may I ask you as well to tell us a little bit about not just where this idea for Jamaica Road began for you, but also when it came to submitting the manuscript and some of the first things you learned about the process of being published?
I was doing a short story course at City Lit, and the course coordinator said, now we're going to do an exercise. And usually when this happens, I'm like, oh, God, because I'm rubbish at exercises. My mind goes blank and I'm still gazing out of the window and everyone else is writing 2 or 3 sides of A4. But the subject she gave us, she said, describe an outsider. And for once in my life, almost by magic, this image of a boy who turned up at my primary school just fell into my head. And this boy was very tall. He had a really shabby uniform. And he had a really strong Jamaican accent. And, where I went to school was very, very white, very, very working class. And while not everybody in the class was a racist, the ones that were very, very racist. And I was the only black kid. And I saw this boy and I thought, oh, my God, now everyone's going to realize I'm black, which is ridiculous because they all knew I was black, but I was just keeping my head down. And straight away, this image of this boy fell into my head, and I could hear the voice of the narrator, her alarm, her surprise, but also her curiosity about this boy and his accent. And so I just wrote my pages of A4 and then left it to one side. And interestingly enough, I went into a competition as well, a short story competition, where I wrote a different story, but that story won. And there was an agent there, and she said, do you have anything else? And I was like, well, no, not really, but I'm working on, I've got this weird idea, and I'm kind of done a couple of pages. She's like, oh, that sounds great. Come back, and she gave me her card. And then it took bloody ages to write this. I mean, like, life gets in the way, and you just think, I'll come back to it. And basically, the agent I have now, she moved agencies 3 times before I actually had something to submit to her. And I put off sending it to her, even when I had the manuscript, because I just thought, it's not good enough. She won't want it. And basically, when I queried her, I also queried 3 other agents, because I thought, Nikki won't want it. It's been too long. And the other 3 agents got back to me and said, thank you for your submission. We'll read and get back to you in due course. I was like, yeah, whatever. Nikki said nothing. And I was like, oh my God, it's right. I was right. She doesn't want me. But by the end of the week, she came back and said, send me the rest. And that was just brilliant. And then I signed with the following week. But it took years to get to there.
Did anybody find that their first novel just tumbled out of them?
No. Quite the opposite, I would say.
Do tell.
Well, I mean, it certainly was a struggle. There are some people here in this room who were present during many of the birth pangs of this novel, and it took over a year, which is not a crazy amount of time, but within that year there was compressed a lot of anguish and torment, and all the usual things. As far as like what got me going in the first place, I think my origin story as a writer is a lot less thoughtful and cerebral and wholesome than some of the ones we've heard. I basically started writing because I felt really, really annoyed at a certain point in my life with a kind of situation and institution that I was in. I mean, this is an Oxford novel. It's set in Oxford, and it's about the various hypocrisies and fatuities of that place that I sort of got more and more irritated with when my time there. And what I've tried to do in it is basically realize these in a way that's sort of cathartic for me, and I hope for other people as well. We all have to wrangle with certain pieties that we find quite irritating every day. But yeah, it's the therapeutic reasons, really, to some degree. Yeah.
And how was it when it came to submitting the manuscript for Shibboleth? In a way, you're going after a lot of the things that could be considered contentious by anyone in the publishing world.
Yeah, you're right. It turns out that all the people who are being satirized in this novel now work in the publishing industry, which is, I should have been you need a bit more foresight, really, perhaps. Thankfully, not everyone who works in the publishing industry are the people, who are satirized in the novel. I mean, just to be clear, the novel is satirizing a sort of a certain kind of fake identity political game that was played in university campuses by quite cynical and mercenary people circa 2016, 2021 or whatever. And I think a lot of the dynamics in this, they do haunt the publishing industry now. I've talked a lot, so just one more thing, the main character, like me, it has Muslim, ethnically Indian, East African Muslim ancestry. And the number of people in publishing when this was on submission who asked me or said to my agent, we love the book, but we just want to check. We see his name, we just want to check that he is, whatever he is in the book. We just, they didn't even have the language to articulate what ethnic credential they wanted me to have, but they just wanted something, they wanted something. And it was that kind of potent mixture of sort of bien pensant rectitude, but also just total ignorance that characterized my experience. Yeah.
Let's get into this subject of identity. When you are writing characters whose experiences are very far removed from your own, do you start by going out and talking to others who are very different from you and build characters based on that? Or do you start with a kind of skeleton for a character whose kind of universal human traits you recognize, but then you understand very quickly that there are things that you have to learn by asking around and talking to others?
What you're saying makes loads of sense for approaching a book, and I feel like what I've done is just take pieces of myself and turn them into characters. And you were describing earlier sort of whether any of us were able to sort of tumble tumble the books out of ourselves. I wouldn't say I did that, but there were moments of tumbling, I think, specifically with the main character, who's the daughter, and her voice really drives the book. And I think I sort of had to move with a lot of speed while writing her, because she's very embodied. She's very like exuberant and kind of uninhibited, and doesn't have any sort of social etiquette or knowledge of society or culture. And she was sort of an experiment for me of like, what would I be like if I had grown up in this situation? And so I think that I had to sort of let her tumble in a way, because otherwise her voice wouldn't have come out with the kind of energy that it did. But I think in terms of crafting the characters, I'm always coming from voice. So I'll always start with, it will maybe be a phrase that keeps coming and repeating in my mind when I'm thinking about that character, and I'll start from that, and that will be the sort of kernel of that voice, and the character will really build from there, I think, rather than me sort of imposing traits on them from outside.
Harriet, To Rest Our Minds and Bodies is also written from voice, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And I can relate to a lot of what you said, where I feel like the urge to write the novel kind of came from certain personal experiences, and then I was curious, like, how can I kind of change this character and change these experiences in a way that makes a compelling novel? So I guess it like started out quite self-absorbed, and then I was like, how can I alter this to kind of make it narratively interesting? And then it was like, once I found the voice, that I was like, actually I can now craft something kind of around these emotions that I was starting with, if that makes sense.
And the same goes for your novel too, William.
Yeah. So my novel, it's a bit of a weird one. The central character resembles me in like certain identity ways. He is like mixed race. He's from the north of England. He's like Jamaican, but like actually is nothing like me, really. I think maybe there's a version of me in a version of him, if that doesn't sound too like novelisty, in that I was like, okay, I need to find where the emotion sits in this person. But the book is actually about him going into a world that he's not used to, this kind of like rarefied, very like London-centric, very like wealth-centric world of the Blake family. And that kind of came from observation. I think when you grow up a person of color in the UK, you are like kind of soaked in whiteness, like it is the majority race in this country. It's the majority of the social situations you'll find yourself in. At least for me, growing up, I was constantly surrounded by whiteness. And then I went to a very white boarding school when I was 13. And so a lot of the characters are sort of stitched together, sometimes lovingly, sometimes slightly disdainfully, from fragments of people that I know or have known. But in terms of voice and how they acted and how they moved and how they interacted with each other, again, it was quite similar to what Rowe was saying. I sort of took pieces of myself and played them out, because I think it's really hard to actually get inside someone else's head and to make what they're doing feel real without understanding the emotion behind it. So often I would like have the character, and I'd like know all their motivations, and then I'd be like, okay, let's put a little bit of me and my emotion into them, and then they would like come to life, and then they would do things that I wouldn't do, but like the emotions were like coming from me into them, and then they would like show me something else back, and I'd be like, oh, cool, that's what they do.
Do motivations of a character set you up well to find the rest of a character? If you have motivations, does that give you the strong basis on which to write the rest?
Yeah, I think so. I think for me in the process of writing this, I knew where I wanted to go, and I knew most of each character's journey, and I knew where we started. We start on this holiday, like day one we're in, but I didn't know how we got there. And so knowing the end point and knowing where the characters were starting from, it was then kind of just fun to be like, okay, what is Annie going to do in this situation? Like, someone's got her back up, like how will she respond? That was really nice. So a bit of motivation, and also just kind of like listening to my characters. Like, I think the first thing that came for me were the characters. They felt really real in my head. And so I was just kind of like wind them up and watch them go. It was quite fun.
Nicolas, you're tackling in England Is Mine a very thorny subject, patently and inherently political. When it came to answering questions your end about your manuscript, the story, the way that you were telling the story, or really anything about the subject matter in your book, what surprised you about that experience?
Yeah, I think when it came to actually writing the book, I started to think of it as sort of a thought experiment, which is to say, in different circumstances, might I, like my second generation protagonist, have been drawn to extremist politics? And I think what I and my protagonist do sort of share is a sense of sort of the way identity forms and a sort of selfhood. So I think when it comes to sort of my identity, I've always sort of thought of it more in cultural terms rather than, you know, in an ethnic, religious or gender sort of sense. Which is to say, you know, I think I've been profoundly shaped by English rock music, the Libertines and Morrissey and the Arctic Monkeys, bands like that. Been profoundly shaped by, you know, English writers like Martin Amis, Zadie Smith, Philip Larkin, and even, you know, English TV shows like Only Fools and Horses and Peep Show and all. But there's definitely, you know, there was a time especially from the sort of 2010s onwards, especially sort of 2013, 14 onwards, when you had a rise in and sort of emphasis on the importance of inherited identities. Most recently, of course, sort of focus on ethnic identity. And I think that's sort of had winners and losers in society. It's sort of revivified some people and been extremely beneficial. But for others, it's left them quite unrooted. And I think my protagonist is sort of one of those characters who's been quite unrooted. So it became sort of a thought experiment. If my favorite musician were cancelled and that part of my identity was taken away from me, sort of, you know, how would I react? All of which is to say, you know, later, sort of when it came to sort of the publishing industry and trying to sort of pitch a novel like this and sort of explain it, you know, I think trying to explain that it was sort of about a sort of sensitive but sort of lazy second-generation Iranian immigrant who radicalized to the far right, you know, sort of raised some eyebrows. And I think similarly there was, as sort of Thomas has alluded to as well, there was sort of a time in publishing when, you know, there was a sort of strong trend of sort of archetypal sort of characters that were supposed to sort of represent something wider than the individual. And that sort of naturally led to, you know, a sort of desire for sort of minority characters to be sort of always sort of positive or so. So I think sort of trying to show the complexity of sort of my second sort of generation protagonist and his sort of conflicted sense of identity and even sort of the appeal of the far right to someone like that was definitely sort of hard to explain. But, you know, eventually I got lucky in finding an extremely supportive agent and editor.
Lisa, I have to bring you in here. When you're writing as you do in Jamaica Road about your London, what is it that you want to convey as a novelist about how you've grown up culturally, that you want readers to understand perhaps in ways that historically they haven't?
While everyone was talking, I was thinking about issues that I had with my editor. And again, my editors were great. Both of them were really, really great. But one of the things they didn't quite get was a character in the novel who basically is a white boy, and he is from a racist family. And this character, Mark Barrett, was, when I first wrote him, he was literally supposed to just turn up, be racist, and then disappear. But for some reason, he just kept hanging around and lingering. I kept writing more and more scenes with him. And, you know, basically I don't think it's much of a spoiler, but he has a bit of a thing for Daphne, even though he's from this racist family. And my editors just did not get it. They didn't get it. They thought it was an interesting scenario, but they were like, what's he doing there? And I was like, I don't know what he's doing there. But they basically just said, you've got to get rid of him. And I was like, no. And it does me defending the white racist. I must have him in the book. No, I don't know, you know, everything about Mark Barrett. I mean, like, he's of all the characters in the novel, he's the one that is still hanging around in my head. So the rest of them all kind of like drifted away, but he's still hanging around. I think there's unfinished business with him. But what I guess it says about identity is growing up in Southeast London at that particular time in the 80s. I mean, I think less so now, but certainly, you know, people lived cheek by jowl, and, you know, in a white working class area, that's where lots of the working class immigrants, the Windrush generation, settled. And so they worked in the same places, they lived in the same places, their kids went to the same school. And so for me, it was a very interesting situation to be in, because, you know, like William, you're kind of like just a couple of black families but surrounded by lots and lots of white people. I mean, South London has changed so much now. It's completely different. But at the time, that kind of thing informed me. And so it was that thing of like going to school and being painfully English, trying to basically fit in. But at the same time, when you go home, it's all about reggae, it's all about ska, it's all about ackee and saltfish and people talking in patois. So there was that kind of dual, I suppose, identity going on. No, you know, that's the interesting thing about the book. And Daphne is British Jamaican. She's British Jamaican. Connie is the immigrant, but ultimately it's Daphne who is looking for belonging.
On class identity, Thomas, in Shibboleth, you're tackling class from a very different perspective. What, if anything, was the role of class in writing your first book?
Good question. It's definitely bubbling under the surface in the novel. I think what I really wanted to show was that in this pressure cooker environment that I'm describing, if you played your identity cards right, if you talked about identity in the right kind of tones to the right kind of haute bourgeois student, you could leverage that into a place on a committee, some kind of short-term social cachet. And it struck me that a lot of the insincerity in the way people were talking about language was a class insincerity. This was a bourgeois language, and it was something that was very, very exclusionary to people who hadn't been to the right schools, who hadn't grown up on the right media, who just weren't quite as au fait with the language of identity as others. It seemed like it was a kind of ruling class project. There's a lot of the comedy of the book derives from the frantic search among people who have been into private schools and who are kind of right at the sort of in the upper echelons of Oxford to try and concoct suitably interesting identity stories for themselves, despite often very, very spurious credentials. I mean, the central romantic relationship, at least of the first half of the book, is between Edward, who is sort of middle of the pack. He's got this one strand of his lineage that's sort of she's from Zanzibar. His grandfather was from Zanzibar, but he looks like I look, sort of, I don't know, whatever you think I look like. That sort, that kind of he presents in that way. But it sort of doesn't matter to Angelica, the love interest. She's so blown over by his exoticism that she kind of turns him into whatever she whatever suits her. And it's obviously it's a heightened dynamic, but it's a dynamic that I think happens a lot these days. The language of identity has been thoroughly commodified, and I've not commodified it. I'm selling a commodity. That's all about it. I mean, this is the water in which we swim. But I also think it's it can be quite funny noticing that, and noticing that when people think they're being sincere, what's actually happening is vast structures of class are just speaking through them. And actually, when they think they're being their most authentic, they're at their least interesting.
Lisa, you mentioned just now Southeast London working class culture. Humour is a big part of that, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I tried to do was think the characters, there is humour there, in the way they talk to each other, the way, the relationships that conveys humour. There's a lot of warmth and people taking the piss out of each other.
How many of you have pushed yourself to try to be funny in your writing? Does it interest you to make people laugh?
When I submitted my book to my agent, I was like, there are some hilarious parts in this. This is a romp. And then she came back to me and was like, I think we maybe need to rebalance the light and dark. It's quite dark, isn't it? So I think that might just be my humour, but hopefully people like me read it and find aspects of it kind of funny, because there are some jokes, but I'd say it leans towards the sort of eerie rather than funny.
Okay, I'm just going to make one comment based on what I know about your book, Life Cycle of a Moth, Rowe. There is a sex scene in your novel, written from the perspective of a fox. Now, of course, it's a violent sex scene. However, I do think that there is something to be said for potentially writing, which nobody has managed to do so far, a good sex scene from the perspective of a house cat, because anyone who does have a cat knows that they have no qualms whatsoever about being privy to it. But anyway,
That sounds nicer than what I've written.
Well, it certainly does sound it, doesn't it? Nicholas, what about you when it comes to writing about extremism? And you mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, how Dostoevsky influenced you with Crime and Punishment. Was the urge to find the humor in it to begin with, or did the humor emerge as a result of writing about this subject?
I think the humor actually really came to me when I was doing a lot of the research for the novel. There was a time when my day would sort of be broken up into different sections of the sewers that I was exploring. So, spend an hour on, 4chan, move over to Telegram for a bit, take some time on a darker Reddit, maybe dip back somewhere else. And I think, one of the sort of misconceptions a lot of people have about extremists and extremist communities is that it's this sort of dour, drab landscape which they're slogging through for, the greater good. But the truth is, it brings a lot of joy to a lot of the people involved in it. It's this paradox whereby, it's clearly incredibly toxic and damaging on a societal level. But, if you're an incredibly isolated individual and you're planning this, far-right raid with your friends online, or, creating far-right remixes of, Toy Story memes, etc., it can be, incredibly fulfilling. It gives you a purpose. It's funny when you're joking around with your friends. You make a lot of friendships. You have an in-language, which a lot of people, having never really been part of a close community before, have never really had. You feel on the inside of something. So there's this world in which, it sort of both salves people, saves them, and also soils them at the same time. So I wanted to show a lot of, the humor as well in the novel, because I want people to understand, why people belong to these extremist communities. You have to show the positive, like alarmingly, disturbingly sort of positive sides for the individual involved, as well as the more negative sides.
Thomas, it seems to me that where Nicholas saw the sides to a lot of the characters that he was writing that in some way endeared themselves to him, yours remains throughout quite acerbic.
Largely, yes. I mean, I don't pull any punches, I think, at any point. There are glimmers of sympathy that may or may not emerge later on in the novel. I mean, I sort of have a metaphysical justification for this, which is that I think actually we all go through life. Everyone is sort of obsessed all the time with like getting in characters' heads, and that's a very important procedure. But I think a lot of us, we go through our lives, and how many times in the day do we actually get a really deep intimation of another person? How often do we really see each other as real? I think so many of our interactions are actually quite superficial, and we sort of look past each other. And I think actually when, for most of the day, we're not real people to each other. When we are real people to each other, it's immensely destabilizing and sort of profound. And I think it can be very useful to hold off in a novel and to create the rhythms of people looking past each other for a long time, and then orchestrate some kind of glimpse of someone's full humanity or whatever later on. And that's kind of what I've tried to stage in a way. Some people are irredeemable and they will, they will not get that moment, but some will.
I think a lot of the reason why not many people do write fiction is because, as Thomas alluded to, we're spending most of our time trying to understand who we are and frantically trying to hold the pieces of our personalities and our experiences together and revise things in the past that have happened and try to plan forward. We're carrying a very full shopping bag all of the time of ourselves. To take large chunks of time out to even just eavesdrop and try to disappear into the experiences of others, I think leaves a lot of people with a feeling of anxiety that if I go too far into the world that exists in other people, then I might lose myself. Does that mean then that a novelist already has a very strong sense of self and they feel confident, therefore, to float off into the world and come back to this home they call me?
No. To piggyback off the metaphor, for me anyway, it was more like dropping the shopping bag and then like looking at like all of my shopping on the floor and being like, that's weird. And then like putting it back together in a new order and being like, I guess I will make something out of this that I hadn't. This is not what I bought it for. This wasn't the recipe, but now I'm going to make something else.
mean, when I start writing, it's very much from a character or from an autobiographical kind of like impulse or memory or something, or someone I've seen, or like you, I'm terrible at just listening to other people's conversations. For me, it's on buses. I love listening to conversations on buses. You know, it's that noticing people and being fascinated and interested and intrigued by them. And so when I'm writing a character that is very different from me, and, you know, not a very nice character as well, it's interesting because one of my tutors at Goldsmiths, when I did my MA there, said that if you sit with a character long enough, they'll start to talk to you. And I was like, yeah, whatever. But it's true. You know, the characters have to kind of leave your mind, the front of your mind, your thoughts about them, and become themselves. And I found particularly with a character that is a particularly nasty person in the book, I had to remind myself that he didn't know that he was nasty. He didn't know that he's a wretch. You know, he thinks that the way he behaves in that kind of abusive, bullying way is to make his sons better men, better proper Jamaican men. And so, so once I kind of let go and kind of thought, well, let's just see where he leads me to, then that made more sense, because I wasn't then trying to control how he should be and say, no, he must be bad. He is bad. His actions show that he's bad. But, you know, he doesn't know that he's bad.
We're coming up to 8 o'clock now, and I think you can tell that we're really getting going here. So perhaps if we take a 20-minute break for you to go to the bar, and we'll come back, and then we'll start to hear some readings. Thank you very much, and a big round of applause to all of our speakers so far.
Calling small business owners. Tired of feeling invisible online? Meet Total Solutions, your modern-day Yellow Pages reimagined for the digital age. Whether you're a service provider looking for more clients or someone searching for the right pro to get the job done, Total Solutions connects local businesses with local people. You can list your services, network with other business owners, or even post jobs if you're the one looking for help. Ready to grow your business or find the next go-to expert? Head to totalsolutions.com to join the community. That's totalsolutions.com.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. During the interval, I was chatting to a gentleman that we'll hear from later on when we have Q&A, Jude Cook, founder of Conduit Books, and co-collaborator with the Booking Club on this event. And he was telling me that when it came to the subject of humour, I made a terrible mistake of not bringing Harriet Armstrong into it, since her novel, To Rest Our Minds and Bodies, is incredibly funny. Harriet, would you like to be the first person to read from your novel?
It may not actually be that. I'm just going to read the opening page and a half. I spent the week before my final year began on holiday with my family. Really, I was still a child then, and sharing a hotel double bed with my child brother. We had so many arguments about the air conditioning, with me desperately wanting it on and him randomly but really persistently wanting it off. It was so revolting to me to feel the sheets clinging to my sweaty skin. I really couldn't take it. It made me feel like some piece of meat or fish being prostrated for sale outside some shop front, lying there sweating like that. I slept so badly that week and had so many stupid dreams like walking down cold marble steps into an infinite expanse of deep black water I had thought was a floor. At the end of this dream, the dream had become self-aware and had given itself a title which was flawless, like flawless. My dumb dream thought it was so witty. On that holiday, I learnt to float passively on my back, to suspend my body on water without exerting any effort at all. I spent hours lying on the water's surface, squinting up at the sun and feeling myself being carried away from the shore towards nothing. It was the first time I had been swimming since I had become really conscious of ideas like the body and virginity and penetration, and so I was hyper-aware of the feeling of the water lapping at my body's thresholds. I was wondering the whole time at the back of my mind whether the water might enter me and flow into my core through all those interior channels and passageways. I really did want to know how far inside of me the water might get. For some reason, everything I wore on that holiday was terrible. Somehow I had no choice and had to keep wearing all these terrible things. I was wearing some awful pair of water sandals, which were a very bright aqua colour and had these densely closed toes. They looked like great blue cockroaches latching themselves onto my feet and digging their claws into my soles. Everyone kept mistaking me for a boy, which had never happened before, and I didn't understand why it was suddenly happening now. I had long hair and everything, although maybe it was a boyish form of long hair, random pieces everywhere with really random lengths. I wasn't sure why my hair had become like that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Smatterings of laughter throughout. What are you talking about? Let's talk a little bit about your novel as being thought of as a campus novel. How do you feel about that? Do you agree?
I think with mine, I was interested in the campus setting because I feel like it allowed this character to be in like kind of a liminal stage of life where she's like not an adult, but she's kind of like learning all these things about adult life like quite late. And I felt like I wanted her to be kind of surrounded by interesting ideas and like interesting content that like from her lectures and things that kind of fascinated her but didn't complete like any sense of kind of a coherent understanding of anything. So I wanted her to feel kind of like in this very engaging context, but still like lacking the ability to kind of like produce an understanding of anything or produce a worldview or like acquire anything that felt meaningful to her. So I guess I was interested in setting it in a university context, but I don't really see it as a campus novel exactly because I don't think she finds that structure so meaningful or doesn't feel she's kind of understanding it in the correct ways.
Lisa, when it comes to your reading, it would be great to hear, if you have it, a passage that conveys what we were talking earlier about the humour as well.
So I'm going to read from the start of the second chapter. So as I said before, Daphne and Connie are at a school in a predominantly white working class part of London. And all you need to know for this part is that it's the end of the day, the end of Connie's first day at this school. Daphne survives at this school predominantly by keeping her head down. And that's not what Connie has done. It was Friday, and my cousins had gone to hang out with friends after school. I stood alone at the Pelican Crossing. The cold was seeping through the knit of my scarf. I wound it around my neck once more, doubling the thickness. Then I pushed the button again. "You're a walk home by yourself," Connie said, arriving at my side. "Yeah," I replied, without looking at him. I willed the green man to appear. "Me have an orange, monsieur, from lunch. You want some?" "No, thank you." All day, I've been trying to be helpful without giving him or anyone else the impression that just because we were both black, we were the same. I hadn't spoken to him when it was absolutely necessary during lessons, and expected that after his run-in with Mark Barrett, he would follow my example of how to behave. But Connie had made no attempt to keep his head down. He'd volunteered to hand out history textbooks, collected our science test sheets, and put his hand up to answer every maths question the teacher set us. When the traffic lights finally changed, I walked across the street and into the park, just managing to keep abreast of Connie's leisurely strides. There were thick privet hedges around the park's entrance, so you couldn't be easily seen from the road. I decided that I could afford to be a bit friendlier now we were further from school. Perhaps I can make him understand the rules. I was deciding how to begin when Connie spoke up. "So, you're an English girl?" "Yeah, well, sort of. I was born here. My family come from Jamaica. My mum arrived in 1962 before independence." "You ever been to Jamaica?" "No, but my grandma's told me loads about it. She came over in the 1970s when I was just a baby." "When did you get here?" "Weeks ago. And we're still in the warm-up yet." Connie chuckled, a deep, husky sound, his shoulders rising and falling in time with his laughter. There was a dimple in his right cheek I hadn't noticed before. I smiled, then quickly covered my mouth and gave a fake cough. "Althea have things to sort out before me could start school." "She's Althea." "Me mother?" "How come you call her Althea?" Connie shrugged. "I call her that from when we was small. She said when we call her mama, it make her feel old. Me little brother call her mommy though, but him too says she don't mind that much." Althea's a top-notch hairdresser. She planned to open up her own salon and call it Noir, which means black in French. At the moment, she worked for a Juragan named Mrs. Samuels, but she determined to have her own place by the time she reached the next 3 years, by the time she reached 30. What? Your mum's only 27? Nearly. Her birthday is not till July. My birthday is November 28th. When you born? May. You Gemini or Cancer? I don't know. Gemini, I think. Good. An air sign. Alfie say fire and air get on well. My mum said only idiots believed in horoscopes, but I didn't say that to Connie. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Could you describe your novel as historical fiction, do you think?
I mean, it's weird because when I was writing it, I didn't actually realise I was writing historical fiction, partly because I didn't realise that my life is... No, I'm old now, you know what I mean? That's the thing. It was like, writing in 1985 about 1980s and early 90s, that was last century. You know, they were... it is historical fiction. But the thing about it, I think, because what I do in the novel is also track some of the real life events that happened, that are happening around Connie and Daphne as we follow them into adulthood. And I think what I was thinking was, when I was writing, was this is Black British history. And then by the end of the novel, I was basically saying, actually, it's not just Black British history. It is British history. It's history. It's stuff that we all should know about. So, yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, I took myself out of the subgenre of being Black British history, just basically saying this is history.
What do you think, Rowe, as to the new family of subgenres that have emerged of late?
The sad girl lit label slightly gets my back up, that label, because I also with the phrases like horror girly, I find it very infantilizing as like a way of marketing things to like probably very intelligent young women. And I think it's, yeah, I don't know, it's a babying of literature that is exploring something incredibly interesting in like psychology, and the psychology of a person. And I feel like sad girl lit really, really dumbs it down as a phrase. I guess, I mean, I suppose I see those sorts of labels as like really they're nothing to do with authors. They're purely for marketing purposes. So I think, you know, I'm just like, call it what you want, but it's the book that it is, and people need to just meet it on its own terms ultimately.
But none of these tawdry subgenre labels ever came near your novel.
The one I've had sometimes is folk horror, which I kind of don't mind as much, because I sort of think of it as to me that applies to film more than book. I think it's starting to be applied in literature a bit more. And there have been a few articles about like folk horror resurgence in literature, which I think is interesting. But again, it's a sort of marketing and way of grouping things. And maybe it's an interesting way of talking about them in like literary theory. But I think to the reader, it's just, I don't think readers are necessarily sort of compelled by that as much as they are by just the individual book.
Which passage from your novel would you like to read for us?
I was going to read, so there's two openings to this novel because it's a dual narrative, so we move between the mother's narrative and the daughter's narrative. The first opening is the mother's narrative, and it is it's very brutal. It's a very brutal scene. It's and it's the reason that they are in the place they're in. And so the second opening is the daughter's opening, which is sort of, I guess, yeah, is bringing the light into that darkness. But the kind of incidents that have passed are kind of I suppose they contextualize the daughter's opening. So I think it's important for me to say that the book does open with that moment of violence before we have this part, which I'm going to read, which is the daughter's opening. My ma calls me daughter, but that is not always my name. What are you now, daughter? She asks. And I tell her I am stone, or vole, or twig, or finger, or worm. She laughs at my names and calls me Little Stone, Little Sniffler Daughter, Crawlykin, Wriggle on the Belly Daughter, Branchling, Finger Daughter. Now I am mud, the clotting that rain makes of dirt. I carry it with me as I tread the forest, a bottle of wet earth tucked into the pouch slung across my bare chest. I think I will be mud for a while before the feel of the name turns dry and gritty in my mouth and I have to spit it out. Then the bottle of mud will go into the museum with all the other names I have carried. In my 15 season cycles, I have been many names, but my ma is always just my ma. I asked her once if she used to have other names too, and her eyes sort of emptied. Then she pinched the skin of her neck and twisted, so I knew not to talk of it again. Late summer air cooling now about me, nipples hardening on my chest like the drops of resin on the pine trunks. Sweat dries in the furry unders of my arms. My pouch hits against my ribs. The sack hangs empty at my side. This, my last chore before dark come, to check the traps and bring the food. As I step between the trees, I am thinking of my ma, of how she was strange this light come. How I woke at the just arrived of the light and the gone of my ma beside me, the door to the house open and bumping in the warm breeze. How I called and heard her just outside, speaking low and not to me. She often talks to herself, so that wasn't the strange part. Not strange even that she came inside with a sliced palm because she said the blood was needed for strengthening the keepsafes. The thing that bent me funny was the sore red color around her eyes. The puff of her lids as if she had been crying, the way I used to when I was a small daughter, but not so much now. Yet in this I cannot find sense, because my ma does not cry. Swipe my knife at a nettle and send the difficult thoughts flopping to the ground with its head. A leaf catches me on the wrist and raises a pink tingle. 9 pairs of traps in the forest, each pair marked by my ma's piles of stones balanced one on top of the other on low stumps. Back when my fingers were short and clumsy, I would try to make my own stone piles, but could never stack more than 3 before they toppled. My ma would crouch beside me to pick up the fallen stones, and I would watch with jealous, twitching fingers as the pile heaped up under her careful hands. I no longer need the stone markers to find the traps, but always the sight of them is firming. A press of my ma's hand at the base of my back. The light will not stick in the sky much longer. Soon dark will come and peel it away. I move quick along the trail our feet have trod so often that the undergrowth is worn thin, a sleeve raised through at the elbow by a bending arm. Our trudge-beaten path, spiraling out from the house and around between the trees until it meets the fence, where walking must stop.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Nicolas, I'd like to ask you a question about the novel in general. Do you think that it's an inherently political form?
Great question. I mean, I'm not sure I would say necessarily that it's inherent in the form. Just as a form, the novel is so capacious and always has been that it can take in politics, it can engage with it. Whether it's sort of a different question, whether, if it's deliberately sort of flouting that, whether it's still engaging in its own way. I think a lot of my sort of literary influences and favorite authors, obviously Dostoevsky is mentioned, Lila Slimani, Zadie Smith, Michelle Houellebecq. They've, engaged with politics, but they've never been didactic. They've always made sure never to speak over their characters and almost to give their characters the best chance of succeeding. I always had this sort of image of the novel as sort of like a church where the sinners and the righteous sort of come together for communion and they sort of lock horns and you sort of let them do so. And to that extent, the novel definitely explores politics, it engages with it. But I was very adamant of my own political views, and as an author, I wouldn't speak over the characters or, doom them just because that might be my inclination.
Where does your reading take us to in the trajectory of the narrative?
So the section I read is from the second half of the book, where my protagonist has moved to the far right, and he's joined a group called Wotan, which stands for Will of the Aryan Nation. And he's participating in a YouTube raid along with his comrades and his friends. The reason I wanted to choose this section is because, I think if there was one thing I wanted people to take away from the book, it was just sort of a better understanding of sort of how and why radicalization takes place. And I think you can't gain that understanding without also seeing, as disturbing as it might be, how sort of personally rewarding and subversively fun life on the fringes can be for people. David slugs Red Bull in serious need of caffeine. It's 3:30 a.m. in England. He's exhausted, with sagging eyes, but it's imperative that he thinks creatively, that he's at his sharpest. As he opens the link, blue light glints eerily out from the slits around the keys under his fingertips. The title of the video is Some Facts About Islam to Combat Racists, and the YouTuber is Emma Donnelly. Despite only being up for a few hours, it's amassed 6,000 views. David checks out her recent uploads. Editing my neck on Instagram for a week. Reacting to people reacting to me. My dog is an idiot. Recreating outfits from Shake It Up, warning, train wreck. Why it's wrong to say all lives matter. And smirks. The customary left-wing mishmash of content. Beauty, fashion, cute pets, and good vibes virtue signaling. He plays a random video. She's about 16 and stunning. Long strawberry blonde hair, big soft blue eyes, bright red lipstick, flawless teeth, flawless white skin. What's she doing lecturing people on Islam? He returns to the relevant video and advances the cursor to the halfway mark. There are two kinds of people in this world during times of trouble. People who come together as one and pause. There's no need to hear more. Using his Amir El-Shahata 2001 fake account, he clicks, I dislike this, and add a public comment. The caffeine is taking effect. He sweeps his tongue across the jagged edges of his upper teeth, left to right to left, thinking. Then writes, disgraceful. You should be ashamed, Emma. I left Pakistan to come to Britain so that I could taste freedom and secular life. I wanted to leave Islam and violence against women and organized marriages and blasphemy behind. And now you want to bring all that here? Why can't you enjoy my freedom? He finishes his Red Bull and switches to his Princess Famida fake account. I was forced to undergo FGM at 6. How dare you tell me these facts about Islam? You know nothing about Islam. You are perpetrating hate. But as long as that gives you more views, I guess that's fine. Enjoy all the expensive skincare products this video will let you buy. As recommended, he sourced the profile picture for the fake account from Instagram. An Asian girl with chunky, transparent frame glasses reading a Penguin Modern Classics book, and applied a rainbow filter to it. He even went to the trouble of adding a cover photo and playlists to her profile page. His fake accounts appear genuine. Supreme Commander Ritter Kreutz has praised him on just how genuine. Over the next hour, David leaves comments from nearly 50.
Thank you very much, Nicolas. That was excellent. I've heard it said by modern readers of the modern novel that now, as a matter of necessity, novelists have to include people's use of social media in their narratives. And many complain that describing somebody using a social media platform or a chat room or forum or whatever is very jarring as a reading experience. It doesn't translate very well. That did, to my ear. But, for example, even just writing characters texting each other, you do this in your novel, William. Have you found that to be a challenge in itself?
Yeah, I do find it challenging and I do find it jarring. And in part, that's kind of why I wanted to put it in, because although we all do it all the time, texting is really, really weird. Conveying your feelings and emotions and thoughts to someone who is in England while you're in France does break your brain when you try and read it, because that is impossible. I think when you're reading a novel and you're like really immersed in someone's perspective, and then it like throws you out of it by sending a text, for me, it was quite deliberate, because like that's a really weird thing to be able to do. So it is jarring on the page. I think it can just look and feel clunky because like you have a break in like the typeface and it looks different, right? But there is also something like kind of extreme about doing it, and it has to be quite important for me in the book anyway. The texts that happen are like plot points, or like they push something forward, or it's a site of people missing each other. There's a moment where someone sends an Instagram DM, which makes me feel a bit nauseous just saying that out loud. And someone misses it and responds later. And like that's an interaction that like only exists because of that technology. And there's also an incident where someone sends a photo and it doesn't load, and so someone misconstrues the message before it. And again, that breakdown in communication, which is a lot of the tension in the book, is about people not being able to or not wanting to communicate. They only happen through technology. And so it can be a really useful device. It is really hard to write because you're like, this feels really weird.
Forgive me, I can't remember the name of the publication that referred to your book as this, but it's been called the hottest read of the summer.
Yeah, that was very kind. I think it was the Sunday Times, which I think my mum like saw that quote in the Sunday Times, and she was like, am I going to have to read about sex? I was like, I mean, you don't have to read it, but I'm going to read a small section from Thursday. So the first half of the book is all set over 1 week where they are on holiday. At this point, we have reached Thursday, and the simmering tension between the narrator and Felix Blake, who is the oldest brother of the Blake family, is kind of coming to the fore. It's been a bit of a slow burn, if you can call 4 days a slow burn. But they're 21, so... and they've taken a walk, and they have decided to go for a swim. It is the narrator and the 3 Blake children. The pool is round and wide and perfect, carved deep into the rock by the tumbling water. It's deeper than I expected, the bottom invisible to the eye. The water is a chocolatey black at its center, fading to gold where it laps gently at the riverbank. There is a barricade of big black stones downstream, where the pool swirls, then spills over the rocky lips of the valley and into the river beyond. I reach the edge and offload my rucksack, glad to be rid of its rough, sticky embrace. I open it and search around, then start to panic as I cannot find what I'm looking for. Lily, standing at the edge of the pool, notices the puzzled look on my face. What's happened? Who has the swimming stuff? I say, even though I know it was supposed to be me. My mind races back towards the chateau, and I see the costumes languishing on the marble countertop. I bite the inside of my cheek and look down at my feet. You're kidding, says Lily. Her tone is deadpan, but there is a smile in her eyes. I'm not going in naked, shrieks Dot. Oh, come on, Dorothea. We were there when you were born, says Felix. It wasn't that long ago that you were parading up and down the chateau naked, claiming to be the Frog Princess. I think you'll be fine. Dot goes beet red. That was years ago, actually, and I'll have you know I was the Toad Queen, and besides, it's different now. She blushes deeper, avoiding my gaze as if I might turn her to stone. Dotty, they're just tits, and yours are lovely. You've got mummies. I'm stuck with the flattest chest in the world, and I don't talk about my body like that. Just shut up, will you? I'm not going in. I'll watch the bags. She stalks off up the bank and sits on a patch of dry earth under a big oak tree, facing away from the pool and our rucksacks. Suit yourself, says Lily, rolling her eyes. She peels off her t-shirt, unhooks her bra, and shimmies off her underwear. There are pink lines around her back and hips. She hops gracefully onto a large rock that leans out over the pool. Her skin, pale and perfect, glows in the light. She dives forward into the water, coming up for a gasp of air, then swimming towards the foot of the waterfall. If I didn't know better, I might think you were some sort of pervert. Felix looks up at me as he bends down to pull his shorts off. You know, if you wanted to see me naked so badly, you just had to ask.
Thank you, William. I noticed in both your readings, Harriet and William, you spoke a lot about water. I think W.H. Auden once said this, that poets have what he called their sacred objects, things that obsess them, that they come back to time and time again. Is water one of those for you?
That's such an interesting question. I think in this book, yes, because I think I'm very interested with this book in the character's kind of distance from the world around her. And I think I use water a lot within it because it's like something that can kind of come so close, and she's like not sure how close it kind of gets to her. And I think at the start and at the end, she's immersed in it and kind of like immersed in the world in a very sensory way. So I was interested in water for that reason, for sure.
Yeah, kind of similar in lots of ways. Water is a big theme in the book, and especially in the relationship between the narrator and Felix, the love interest. And I think for me, it's like water's got so many qualities that can really be applied to emotion, but also to like how you communicate with people. So it like can reflect, it can obscure, it can magnify, it can cool things down, it can ruin them completely. And so at various points, you have like the pond, you have the pool, and you have a huge lake that they go to, and the sea as well. They all like, all the different forms of water serve a different purpose, whether it is to like heighten things, or like there's a moment where he goes underwater and then can't hear or see what's going on around him. So yeah, its ability to like connect and also disconnect is the common theme, I guess.
Thomas, which passage are you going to read for us from Shibboleth?
I've not chosen one of the... I mean, I daren't go for a steamy one after there are many, and they're not that steamy. So I'm going to go for something nearish the beginning, so it's reasonably comprehensible. And it's the moment when Edward, who's the main character of the book, meets his sort of best mate, who's a rather loud and brash and charming in his own way Egyptian Muslim called Yusuf. Yusuf is extremely intrigued by Edward's Muslim and East African family, almost to the point of ridiculousness, as you'll see. I should say I've not entirely chosen when I'm going to end this. So if you can all just look really, really grumpy and pissed off, if I'm going on too long, and sort of emanate boredom to me, and I'll stop. All right. Okay. Edward? The clap on his shoulder was enough to knock him off balance. Edward, it is you. Turn around at once. No, not like that. Stand like a man. Embrace me. Yusuf? He squinted back up at the broad silhouette. I thought you were getting back tomorrow. Precocious in all things, Edward. He has come. The college may cease to hold its breath. Oh, no, I won't, thank you. Yusuf made a show of foregoing the cider he hadn't actually been offered, but which he'd noticed, unopened, protruding from Edward's carrier bag. He had given up on alcohol for Ramadan, he explained, and bowed his head in a way that made it clear that Edward was to admire this monk-like show of devotion. He had also shaved off last year's beard, a chin strap for whose peculiar patchy shape Yusuf claimed to have found justification in at least 3 different holy books, and without it his face was rounder, bloated, presumably from all the fun he had been having over the summer. Job interviews, Yusuf explained, stroking his chin. Unsuccessful, alas, Goldman bastards, Rothschilds bastards. I'll grow it back, of course, he added. My outward appearance will once again reflect my inner piety. But in the meantime, it's all a bit, well, death to the West. He crouched down next to Edward and began to look at him. You look ill, Edward. Why, thank you. He nodded grimly. Fragile. Sick. Yes, thank you. I'm glad you added 2 more adjectives. Wilted. Impotent. Strangely effeminate, even. Where's that tan all you white people are meant to covet? What have I told you about venturing north of London during vacations? You've not been at that family again of yours, have you? Edward? Edward, where are you going? I was just leaving. Well, now you are staying. He began fumbling with his blazer. Now, my vacation, of course, was rich and varied and full of important moral lessons. Yusuf, yes, I know you're desperate to hear about it, but there are dramatic considerations, many of which take time. Where shall Yusuf... Where shall Yusuf begin? Where shall he pause for effect? Which of his many conquests will he relay in all their glory, and which will he pass over in dignified silence? He shrugged his blazer off his shoulders and began to lay it on the grass. What? No, don't sit down. Yusuf, you really want to leave? Yusuf was smiling now in the broad, uncomprehending way he always did when he wanted to make himself impossible to resist, and ruin our formidable demographic advantage. Come, Edward, is this what the Prophet did at Badr? I have absolutely no idea what the Prophet did at Badr. I shall be honest with you, Edward. I too am hazy on the details, but I'm told it was very impressive. Yusuf was the first person Edward had met at Oxford, and the origin of their friendship, like those of most male friendships, had been strictly administrative. Last year's room ballot had placed Yusuf in 33A, with its fireplace, its mezzanine, and the walk-in wardrobe that seemed so perfectly calibrated to house his treasury of crisp tweed blazers that you could only assume that Allah himself had effected the allocation. Edward had been assigned 33B, a former priest hole with great wreaths of mould and plumbing that wailed like a call to prayer every morning the moment Yusuf cranked down the handle to commence one of his 40-minute showers. What Edward first noticed about him was not his immaculate suit or his intimidating watch or even the effortful way he adhered to his public school accent, but the sheer physicality of him, the way his wide, boisterous, clumsy frame creaked floorboards as he approached, the way his suitcases dislodged blizzards of plaster from the corners of inconvenient walls as he hooted his vague general greetings up the stairs. When he first pitched up on the landing, Edward had gone to shake his hand, only to be pulled into a long, pulverizing embrace. And while he politely tried to wriggle free, Yusuf scolded him for being so timid, for letting Oxford turn him into one of those shy, precarious little creatures of the written word it specialized in churning out, as if this country needed more of them. His name, he said grandly, once Edward had finally been released, was Yusuf Shamak. What was his? Edward? Oh, well, he couldn't be expected to remember that. What did he study, anyway? English? A grave mistake. I'd have assumed you spoke that already, he said. Yusuf Shamak, he explained as the two of them ambled down to face the single wine-fogged night of socializing the members of their staircase undertook before forgetting about each other completely, didn't care about Shakespeare or Milton or any of those Englishmen of dubious sexuality whom Oxford would simply not let die. He had no need of such things. Not because he was impervious to beauty or because he underestimated the contributions to human culture made by civilizations other than his own, but because literature, he maintained, was for shy people with a hole inside them, and Yusuf was so full of life he just might burst any second. Thank you.
I'm going to open it out now to the audience. Are there any questions? Yes, we have one here.
Hello, thank you so much. That was very inspiring to hear all of you, and I really love this event, so thank you for having us. I have a question which really kind of jumped to mind as I was listening to all of your amazing stories and everything, and I hope it's not something that compromises everyone, but when we're talking about putting your identity on the page, and I suppose the role of the author on the page and within these stories, and I know it's a non-fiction book, but I would love to know your thoughts on the soul path and everything that's happened around that, if you're happy to talk about it.
I think the wonderful thing about novels, even when they might be based in like personal fact or feeling, is that your job is to make stuff up. And that's your contract, right? I think when you flip over into memoir, there's a responsibility and a literal legal contract that what you're writing is true or true to you. And I think I read The Soul Path and I really liked it. And then I read the Observer article and like holding the two things, I was like, oh, that's weird. Like I felt like a personal like response. Like I felt like I'd been lied to, which like in a way, like an inconsequential way I had, but like, I think the thing with memoir is that like you are taking on like a contract with your reader that this thing is real and that the lessons that maybe you've learned or are trying to impart are part of that reality. But what you get to do as a novelist is you enter a contract where you say, this isn't real, but I want to make you feel something. And so you're free to then play around with form and with truth and to do that in a way that is like more authentic. Whereas I think what she's trying to do in The Soul Path is probably right. But by going about it in that way, you break the contract, and that's the disappointing thing about it, maybe.
I mean, I actually, in many ways, quite almost diametrically disagree with that. I've always assumed memoir to be a basically fraudulent form. Ever since Augustine in the Confessions goes on and on at some length about how he feels really guilty about sort of stealing pears from a lush pear tree as a choice. You think, now, how much of this is sort of concocted for me? I think this sort of realism of genre, siloing up all literature into a set of discrete sort of contractual forms, and is perhaps not the way we come up with particularly interesting literature. I've not read much of The Salt Path, not a huge fan of what I've read, but I sort of found myself admiring it slightly more once I realized it was fraudulent in that way, in a sense. I mean, I mean this in all seriousness. I mean, if it is just a memoir, it is pure testimony, and I'm afraid a lot of books that are out there right now purport to be pure testimony. If it is a kind of Pierre Menard-esque hoax, then for me at least, maybe it's because I'm thoroughly cynical and debauched, but like I think there's something galvanizing about that. There's something interesting in that. I mean, this is a contrarian take perhaps, but I do think there's a certain corrective to that spirit of play, trying to wrong foot mislead the reader. It's something that used to be, I think, more present in literature. In my day job, I'm a Borges scholar, and Borges can't exist without that spirit. And a lot of writers I admire very much couldn't exist without that impulse.
Please, Rowe. Sorry.
Thank you for your question. That's so interesting. I think I just wanted to come back to what Will was saying about responsibility, because I feel that with, I think all of us in our books are handling like some heavy subject matter in various ways. So I think that question of responsibility is there always in anything that you write. For example, I mean, the context for my book is around male violence, and there is a responsibility in the way that I portray that. And for people who have experienced that, I want that to feel like it is treated with nuance and treated with respect. And I suppose with something like The Salt Path, what it makes me think of is, I suppose you have that assumed truth of memoir. And I agree with Thomas that often memoir can be fraudulent and it is played with and played up perhaps. But I think maybe what troubles me about The Salt Path is the sort of context of illness and things where there are people who are having experiences and going through things that are very, very, very difficult, and that in creating a sort of as if she has made up things around the illness in particular, then there is a breaking of responsibility there in the way that you're handling subject matter that is very tough for people. I always want to be mindful of that in anything I'm writing, and I would assume that a memoir writer would be doubly so. But I mean, I don't know. I've also not read The Salt Path. In some ways, I think that the massive hubbub around it recently is like a weird distraction from other horrible things that are happening in the world. And this kind of literary scandal always gets really overblown, and I don't necessarily have all the context for it, but I think I just agree with Will's sort of loading of responsibility. I think that's important.
I see another hand here. This gentleman 3 rows back from the front.
Marilyn Robertson took 24 years between writing her first novel, Housekeeping, and her second novel, Gilead. And I think Joseph Ross took 50 years between Call It Sleep and his second novel. Is there any real reason to write another novel for you? I mean, I imagine you're all thinking of it. But is there really any point? You all have a novel in you, but do you have a second novel in you?
My main reason would be my mortgage. No, just because that's what I want to do. It's what I want to do with my life. I find the process of writing a novel very stimulating. I feel I have stories to tell. Maybe the novel I write in 20 years will be my second best. But unfortunately, I will write a few more in between.
There's a line in the passage that you read just now, Thomas, which obviously I've read because I've read this far into it, but it kind of tees up in my mind another question where you said, Yusuf scolded him for being so timid, for letting Oxford turn him into one of those shy, useless little creatures of the written word it specialised in churning out as if this country needed more of them. Does the country need more of them? I ask this because I think it does. I think part of the reason that we're here is to really draw attention to the fact that literacy, by many measures, according to much data, is in decline, and the status of the novel in society isn't what it was. Do you sense it? Does it worry you?
In a way, I think, again, it's slightly deranged to talk about the people in the book as if they're real, but if you'll indulge me for a second. Yusuf is, despite his protestations and his profession not to trust literature, he's astonishingly inventive with language and like, I hope, funny in a way that not everyone in the novel is, let alone in life. And I wonder how much of that little aside is actually directed at the shy and useless bit, and how much of it is directed at literature. I think we have a responsibility, perhaps, as writers, to try and cleave apart that association and not to be too meek and cloistered and try and write about the world in a way that makes people feel things.
Is there anything that the novelist can or should do to try and draw attention back to themselves and the medium?
I will say, I think that there's much more of an emphasis now and recently on like the novelist as a persona. I mean, there's expectations around social media. I think it even relates to your question about the sort of scandal around the Salt Path, because I think that it's tied to this obsession with the author as a sort of figure. And I suppose really the author is actually this really like silent presence and probably a really introverted person who sits in their room all day like making things up. Like you say, there are so many other sort of forms of media that are competing for people's attention, and so much of that spills over into like YouTube, and there's the whole, actors will do a press junket. It's all about the personality. And I think that's sort of spilling into the author profession more as well.
As evidenced by this event.
Which I don't necessarily have any like feelings about it particularly, good or bad. It's just interesting to me that's it. The author persona seems to be having so much more of a cultural moment, and there's certain expectations that come along with that.
Literary fiction today, but historically as well, has predominantly been consumed and enjoyed and advocated for by women. And there's obviously talk about the gender balance within publishing, those manuscripts that are accepted, just the volume of manuscripts that are submitted by female writers because of the demand for literary fiction by a female audience. I mentioned him at the beginning, and it's important to bring him in here, the co-collaborator in this event, Fiction First. If Duke could make himself known through the mic and maybe talk a little bit about how the establishment of Conduit Books speaks to that asymmetry.
Hi, Jack. Yeah, I thank you. But I think the panel are much better in articulating their answers to that question in terms of any kind of gender balance between men and women in publishing. So perhaps they can answer that question, if indeed they can.
Yeah, no problem. Well, does anyone have any strong opinions about that? Any strong feelings? Again, it kind of goes back to where we started in this conversation about your experiences of reaching publication.
This is the male writer question.
This is, I guess, is partly the male writer question, but maybe it's more to do with where the demand is coming from for the novel.
One thing that really interested me when my book came out, it came out fortuitously at a time where the question of male novelists and male novel writers was extremely in the news. And I think this book, in a way I hadn't really foreseen, was really read as a male book, a man book, in a way that it was totally surprising to me. I mean, you sort of play this game before the book comes out. Which strand of the complicated concoction that is my identity will be plucked out of my soul and sort of co-opted into the marketing campaign? And it was my sex, my gender. What interested me is, I think it's probably fair that there are, as things stand, more women publishing like literary fiction in the UK than men on average. But what I slightly am concerned about is, I think whenever this discourse item clanks into life, people start getting very, very slapdash in their, very, very, very willing to conflate the person from whom the book is emanating with the content of the book. There's this idea that men write about men things in men ways and women write about lady things in lady ways, and it's all very ridiculously Victorian. I think that I'm not accusing anyone of that here, but the discursive half-life this stuff leads can be really, really pernicious. I think we all have, I certainly think there are some of the best literary male characters in fiction written by women. I mean, it's just incontrovertible. I think there are one or two. I think men probably even slightly less good at doing the obverse over the years, probably because they, in day-to-day life, perhaps don't have to think about it so much. But there, Madame Bovary, I'm a defender of, and it has worked the other way as well. And I think a really enlightened publishing industry would be one that realizes that that we all contain multitudes, and that and that there is that necessary connection between author's sex and the sex of the characters or the content is not there. Oh, thank you very much.
I'm looking for hands, so please raise them. We have one at the front here, second row from the back.
Thanks for everything you've been talking about, and it's really interesting that there's such a variety of themes and subjects on display tonight, which I think is really exciting. I was thinking about the fact that publishing industry really is centered around the comp system, and I wondered whether or not any of you guys have any thoughts about the authors or books that you've had your debut novels compared to during this process of being published. And I'm intrigued to know if you felt that those comp titles were right for your book, or if you felt that, you were kind of really glad to be compared to that author that you really love, and yes, that's who you feel is an influence. Or do you feel like you are pigeonholed? Do you think it's a good system? I'm just really interested to know how you feel about that.
Yeah, literary influences. Let's talk about them.
Yeah, I mean, there's kind of two parts to that, I guess, in my head. My novel has been, maybe against my will initially, billed as not being like a book, but being often compared to Saltburn, which obviously was like a cultural juggernaut. It deals with some similar themes. But I don't know, I think sometimes direct comps can be quite flattening, or place a potential reader in mind of something that actually is maybe a next best fit, but doesn't really describe what you're trying to do. I also think it is an inevitable part of the system and the machine, is because you need a shorthand way to evoke something in someone, either a potential reader or in a marketing team or in sort of a head honcho, a publishing house. So it is really useful. I think where maybe as a writer it becomes more fulfilling is when you get to touch on your literary influences and what has inspired a work. And for this, while Saltburn, the film, the trailer came out when I handed in my first draft, and I was like, oh, here we go. And it is very different, but it's a cultural comparison that's I've now come around to seeing that it's quite useful. That film grows quite a lot at the box office, so people know what it is, right? So they can immediately connect to it. But also, this is a book written about class and about race, but about class in a time when class inequality is widening in the UK and where those differences are becoming more apparent. Saltburn is a film that was made out of that same widening inequality, and my literary influences are other books that look at that process, but maybe from a different time frame and maybe with like a different racial lens. So things like The Great Gatsby, like Brideshead Revisited, like a lot of like Wharton and kind of like turn of the century American novelists. So it's like, it's about like drawing on what the cultural influences are and also like where we see ourselves reflected in like different time periods. So in short, it's complicated.
Yes, comparisons and influences. What was the book that made you want to write, Lisa?
And certainly, I mean, for this novel, one of the influences was A Brief History of 7 Killings. I mean, what I liked about that was the way it's very character driven, and each character has a different voice, but it's very much about how, you know, what's happening in Jamaican society in the 70s has an impact on their lives. And then that's kind of, I suppose, when I started to properly write this novel, and I was thinking about, you know, absorbing steeping myself in the times, you know, by reading newspapers and seeing what was going on. That was what I wanted for my characters, for them to be absorbing what is going on around them and to explore how that influences the choices they make.
Harriet, when it comes to comparisons, what was the comparison that you would just die of joy to hear?
I feel like I got quite lucky with this because I think my book is kind of self-reflexive in a way that it like names its influences because the character's reading them. And so I think it like made it kind of obvious what comparisons to draw, and like they were like my dream comparisons because they're like my favorite writers, so like Tessa Mushbe, Miranda July, Elif Bachman. Yeah, I think it's kind of inevitable that I would feel flattered by these rather than wishing for like a different reading. I've been really happy. Yeah.
And what are you planning to write next?
I'm hoping to write something slightly more kind of crime infused in a way, and like slightly more plotty, like kind of Bret Easton Ellis is like a bit of an influence for this. I'm very early on in the process, but I feel like this one was so internal and so kind of based on this one woman's mind, kind of lacking structure, lacking plot, and I'm interested in doing something kind of slightly more, dramatic.
We'll keep our eyes peeled for that. Is there anybody else who has a second novel in mind already? Anything that they would care to discuss at this point, or are you all keeping it very much under your hat?
I fear if I name it, it will fit away. It's under construction.
That brings us to the close of Fiction First. I just want to thank our audience so much for your wonderful questions, for coming here tonight to share in the celebration of these 6 debut novelists. I'm Jack Aldean. This has been the Booking Club Live. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you.